I think we're ready to get started.
Let's do it.
Director, welcome to Arizona. It's nice to be away from DC, I think, right? I could say the same. So I'd like to dive right in, Director. We have a lot of ground to cover. We have about 45 minutes, and there are a lot of threats out there. FBI has a unique place in the U.S. government as both the lead federal law enforcement agency, but also the FBI is part of the U.S. intelligence community. As such, you have to balance both roles and responsibilities. Do you find any tension there?
I actually don't find a tension. I think the two roles complement each other extremely well, and I say that because I know that there are a lot of countries out there, not all of them, but the number of countries where they do have those things in separate agencies. And one of the striking things to me is how much disconnect there is in a lot of those countries. In fact, ironically, in a lot of foreign countries where we have FBI agents embedded, we end up functioning as a bridge between two agencies of the same foreign government, namely their domestic security or intelligence agency and their law enforcement agency. So ironically, the U.S. is essentially helping them communicate with each other. So we're very glad to have the set up the way we do. I think part of the reason for that is we're in a world now where this sort of artificial distinction between national security threats and purely criminal threats has kind of mushed together. You can see it, for example, in the cyber arena, where more and more it's pretty hard to tell where a nation state cyber actor and a cyber criminal, where one ends and the other picks up. So we see nation states, China, Russia, Iran, contracting out to cyber criminals, almost like cyber mercenaries, to do a lot of their work. We see intelligence officers, cyber intelligence officers of foreign intelligence services moonlighting on the side to make extra money as cyber criminals. We see nation states using cyber criminal tools to try to hide their involvement. So you don't want to have that stovepiping that exists there. On the counterterrorism side, it's a little bit the same thing. We're a little bit past the world of kind of card-carrying, bright, clean, this person's Al-Qaeda, this person's Al-Shabaab. More and more now we see people with the kind of, again, sort of a mush of different ideologies. We had one not that long ago. I see Senator Klobuchar out there in her home state, where we had a couple guys who identified themselves as Boogaloo Boys, which people think of as a domestic terrorism belief system. But they ultimately decided what they wanted to do was provide material support to Hamas. You know, the two things don't add up, but we need to be in a position where we can see both sides of the continuum. And so that's been very helpful. It's also true that intelligence drives more effective law enforcement. So even outside of traditional, even outside the national security threats, things like violent crime, gun crime, us being able to marshal intelligence about what are the drivers in a particular city of gun crime, of violent crime, allows us to then partner with our state and local counterparts to be more effective. And intelligence is really just about making better decisions. And I guess the last point I would say is, you mentioned the intelligence community. One of the really great things I've observed since being in this world for a long time and then leaving to go in the private sector and coming back is when I compare today's intelligence community to the intelligence community that I saw in the 9/11 era, it's night and day. It's truly a community now. I can't remember, I'm now 4.5 years into this job, I can't remember a turf battle, a conflict. I have senior CIA, NSA, DIA representatives on my senior staff every morning. It really is, it feels much more like a big family where everybody is kind of moved away from the era of tension, past the era of deconfliction, past even the era of collaboration now to integration, which I think is a great thing for America.
Crushing the stovepipes, joint terrorism task forces, as you alluded to, it's very important to note that intelligence and law enforcement is resident in the joint terrorism task forces. Now, those are some great points. So what I want to do is change gears a little bit and focus for a few minutes on what you might see happening as a result of Ukraine in terms of Russia. So Obviously, the campaign by Russia is not going well on the ground. Putin, and we're grateful that that is happening, right? That there's a struggle and that the conflict continues disappointingly to drag on for the Ukrainian people. But all of that said, Putin has repeatedly threatened to take action against the West. He is unhappy right now with the United States arming the Ukrainians. Are you concerned that there'll be some level of retaliation? Are you concerned specifically about a cyber attack directed against the United States critical infrastructure as a result of what's playing out right now?
Certainly, it's something that we're concerned about, and we've been working to try to prevent and preempt for quite some time now. There are a number of things we're concerned about. One, Russia cyber targeting of our critical infrastructure, that's not new. They've been doing it for a number of years. But the same access that they've historically used and that their intelligence services have used for espionage to exfiltrate information, that same access to some companies' networks can be used for destructive purposes as well. So that's something we're concerned about. We're also concerned about what we call spillover. The Russians, the same kind of recklessness that we've seen from the Russians on the battlefield in the Ukraine, this sort of wanton disregard for innocent life.
Human rights.
We see that in the way they conduct cyber activity. It's reckless there too. The best example of that is the NotPetya attack a few years ago, where they targeted the Ukraine. Even then, with what was styled as a ransomware attack, but it really was just intended to destroy systems. But it didn't just hit Ukraine; it hit systems here in the U.S. and Europe and all over the world, and cost $10 billion. That's with a B, dollars in damage. I think it was the most costly cyber attack in history. So that we're concerned about. We're also concerned about cyber criminals, who awful lot of them are in Russia. Where there's been a pretty safe, comfy operating environment for them quite some time, taking advantage of this moment either to help the Russian government or just to take advantage of a very permissive operating environment. So we've got a 24/7 cyber command post running. We've been pushing out intelligence products, warning companies about what we're seeing, pushing out technical information to network defenders. I think the thing that a lot of people don't understand about cyber attacks is they don't just happen overnight. And that's actually a good thing, because what happens is most of the time there's research, there's scanning, there's probing for vulnerabilities, there's all kinds of preparatory activity to get into the network in order to be able to do whatever awful thing the hacker wants to do. And so the sooner, the earlier in the process we can be engaged with the companies to help them detect what it is and mitigate the harm, the better. So we are uniquely positioned with agents all over the country to be able, any company, critical infrastructure company anywhere in the country, we can have an agent on their doorstep within about an hour to help figure out what they've got and then figure out how to mitigate it.
So, Director, I saw the 60 Minutes episode that you did last Sunday. And I think it was well done. And I encourage folks to go online and read the transcript. I also noted that Scott Pelley, who's not Chris Costa, but Scott Pelley also said that the FBI seems to be on a war footing, or maybe you said it to Pelley, but it seems that that's what you just articulated.
It feels that way to us. I mean, I think we think that the Russians, when it comes to the United States, in a conventional military sense, are at a distinct disadvantage. But what they do have is an asymmetric weapon, which is cyber activity, and perhaps the delusion that it provides them some level of plausible deniability.
So we'll stay on the Russian topic for just a minute, but change gears a little bit. So this is one of my favorite questions. It'll be apparent why. So the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., we have lots of artifacts, and we tell stories from the fight during the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, tit for tat, intelligence officers versus intelligence officers. That played out throughout the Cold War, and we have the artifacts to reinforce that struggle that played out. All of that said, other than cyber, in terms of Russian threats, the more traditional threats threats of IOs or intelligence officers, Russian intelligence officers. Maybe you can share some perspectives on what you're seeing and what the FBI is doing to mitigate some of those threats.
I mean, the traditional spy versus spy, like something out of a le Carré novel, that stuff still exists for sure. But I think in some ways, the Russian counterintelligence threat, I wouldn't say it's gotten better. It's just different. It's more complex in some ways. We certainly have made significant strides over the last few years in reducing the Russians' intelligence officer footprint in the United States. And I'm very heartened to see that a lot of our good friends overseas, a number of partners there, have now taken action as well. And that's important because unlike the Chinese, the Russians don't have the ability to rely on legions of non-traditional collectors in the same way. Now, they still have too big of an traditional intelligence footprint in the United States. There's a reason they target the United States. It's to advance their interests. And if anybody has any doubt about what their interests are, you can just look at the Ukraine. So we're worried about that. We're spending a lot of time countering that. They also are heavily engaged in tech transfer, dual use technology to advance their military. And that's something we have to work with the private sector to counter. They're, of course, very involved in malign foreign influence, sowing divisiveness and discord, related to elections and that kind of thing. And we obviously been very heavily engaged on that. And we never forget who we're dealing with. All you have to do is look at what they did to Skripal in the UK to be reminded.
The poisoning of
these are dangerous.
Former intelligence officer, 2018,
These are dangerous people.
That's right. And you can see some of their assassination tools again at the museum, but there are lots of stories of assassinations, intelligence officers tracking people, Russians tracking dissidents worldwide. Some of that's playing out just today. I think I read it in the Post, as a matter of fact. So let me change gears again and talk about something different that's very concerning, and I think this audience, it will resonate with. One of the programs that the McCain Institute focuses on is combating human trafficking. And again, back to Ukraine. Currently, there's a refugee crisis, there's a humanitarian crisis. Lots of people, the population is moving out of Ukraine. There are children in that population. Are you concerned, is the FBI concerned, and what are you seeing in terms of human trafficking as a result of that displacement? Are kids vulnerable in the Ukraine?
Well, we're very aggressively engaged in the fight against human trafficking. And typically, our big contribution is going after a lot of the criminal enterprises that prey upon, in particular, children in a way that I think can only be described as, medieval. I mean, it's a modern form of slavery, and it's kind of blows the mind that something like that could happen in the world that we live in today, but it is rampant and it's a deep concern. And those are the kinds of people who would try to take advantage of chaos and displacement in a place like the Ukraine. We have, I think, 86 child exploitation and human trafficking task forces. We have a task force with representatives of 50 other foreign governments focused on the issue. Last year, we arrested, I think, 785 human traffickers, and you think about how much each one of those traffickers affects. So we're rescuing, saving, identifying, helping hundreds of kids, and we work very closely with not just law enforcement partners, but a lot of the NGOs, because that's often where the information first comes in, and we're trying to take a very victim-centric approach to the problem.
Yeah, it's definitely disturbing, and I really appreciate your insights on that. So I'm going to talk about China in terms of their cyber threat. We already talked a little bit about Russia and the possibility of a cyber attack. So I want to pivot a little bit on China, cyber intrusions, and I want to make sure I get this right, because again, you referenced this, I think, on the 60 Minutes episode, and you've talked about this in the past on the road. China conducts more cyber operations against the U.S. than all other countries in the world combined. If that's true, and I got that right, that's not only disturbing, But what are they trying to accomplish, Director?
Well, there's 2 points there. One is that they have a bigger hacking program than that of every other major nation combined. And their biggest target is, of course, the United States. The second is that they have stolen more of Americans' personal and corporate data than every other nation, big or small, combined. In some ways, maybe that shouldn't come as a surprise. The Chinese don't do anything small. Their focus is trying to steal their way up the corporate ladder, to try to steal American companies' innovation, American companies' trade secrets, intellectual property, to try to jump ahead when they can't innovate and manufacture it themselves. And I could look, for example, at, they have about, across the Chinese state, in pretty much every major city, they have thousands of either Chinese government or Chinese government contracted hackers who spend all day with a lot of funding and very sophisticated tools trying to figure out how to hack into companies' networks, not just in the US, but in other leading nations, to try to steal their trade secrets. Last year, there was a hack involving a Microsoft Exchange server that was done by the Chinese government. They targeted and hit, I think, 10,000 US entities, right? So each one of those is a business, big or small, or some other kind of organization, and basically were planting back doors on those companies, on those businesses' networks. We worked with our partners, both in government and in the private sector, especially Microsoft, to help slam shut those back doors, in effect, on the systems, and then worked with our allies to attribute the attack to the Chinese government. But that's just one campaign, 10,000 organizations targeted there. And what makes it so dangerous is that they pair that cyber activity with human intelligence operations too. So if they can't get the information through cyber means, they will corrupt insiders, buy off somebody working inside the company to steal the information that way. And so you put those two things together, and that's why the FBI has a new China counterintelligence investigation opened just about every 12 hours. And it's sure,
I saw that statistic.
And I can assure you, it's not because our agents don't have enough else to do with their time. It is just constant. Every single one of our field offices has investigations, and they all trace back to the Chinese government in some way.
And as you pointed out, not just investigations, but your agents are out there engaging with the private sector, providing warnings. And that's a new dynamic, a relatively new dynamic, that kind of engagement on the scale that the FBI is doing it now, or at least it seems to me as an outsider that the scale of the FBI providing warnings to the private sector is significant.
That's a huge part of today's FBI, and it will be an even bigger part of tomorrow's FBI. Our mission statement, if you will, has ahead of the threat. And in order to be ahead of the threat, we have to be out engaging with potential victims to try to help them harden their systems to try to prevent, to detect, disrupt malicious cyber activity or economic espionage or whatever it happens to be. And when I look at today's FBI and compare it to the FBI of 20 years ago when I was intimately involved in all this stuff before, there's a big difference. If the director of the FBI in, say, 2003 had called the head of any FBI field office and said, who are the biggest private sector partners in your area? You would have had crickets chirping, and then, sir, I might have to get back to you on that. Now, I can almost guarantee you that I can call any SAC, special agent in charge of any FBI field office, and ask that same question. They'll rattle it off just like that. Not only which companies, they'll be able to tell you what their big issues are, who their points of contact are, when the last time they met with them. Every FBI field office has a private sector coordinator. We have a whole division at headquarters that's called the Office of the Private Sector, and that's because the attack surface is so much in the private sector. It's information that our adversaries are targeting, whether it's cyber, economic espionage. In our country, 85% or something of our critical infrastructure is in the private sector. We're not China or Russia. And so if we're going to defend our critical infrastructure, we've got to be lashed up tightly with the private sector, which is what we're doing.
So I hope I'm not being repetitive here, but I want you to put a finer point on Chinese activities against dissidents here in the United States and against Uyghurs, for example. China has a policy worldwide of repressing their citizens, but there are also Chinese Americans here in the United States. Are they free? Are they unencumbered from Chinese intelligence officers going after them? In other words, Chinese here in the United States.
I think that's a part of the Chinese threat, the Chinese government threat, that I think people don't fully appreciate, which is the same repression that is widely known to exist in China, they export, including to right here in the United States. So they have long targeted and harassed Uyghurs, Falun Gong members, dissidents, et cetera. That continues. But some of this is repression targeting American people lawfully here in the United States, American citizens in a number of instances, but at least people lawfully here, part of the diaspora, by threatening, harassing them, stalking them, sending Chinese officials either under the guise of law enforcement, that they're not coordinating with law enforcement in this country, or their intelligence services. We had a case just last month in New York where there were indictments of a number of MSS officers for harassing Chinese nationals living in the U.S. By including things like planting surveillance equipment in their homes and vehicles. This is happening here in the United States. I think about, there was an American kid at a Midwestern university, Chinese-American kid, who tweeted or posted, I can't remember which social media site, praise for the Tiananmen Square protesters. And almost immediately, back in China, suddenly the Chinese intelligence services made a visit to his parents and started threatening him because of their son's post. This is an American kid at an American university being harassed for his views, for his expression.
It's extraordinary. Well, it's great that the FBI is all over that. And I should say Ministry of State Security, MSS, that's the acronym for the Chinese Intelligence Services. And of course, it's the FSB, which was formerly the KGB in terms of Russia. So let's completely change gears. If we were here in this forum 20 years ago, and we were asked to have a conversation about the threat, we would have been talking principally about Al-Qaeda. Think about that, right? We would have been talking about Al-Qaeda. There was no such thing as ISIS. So flash forward where we are today. How are you thinking about international terrorism? Has that threat diminished?
People ask me that a lot. I wouldn't say it's diminished. I wouldn't say it's worse. I would say it's changed. And certainly I think about 9/11 almost every day. As somebody who was in the FBI headquarters building on 9/11, intimately involved in the response, met with the families of the victims, in my last life in government. And in many ways, it's what motivated me to come back into service. On top of that, we still have FBI agents and other first responders who are dying, even as we speak, from cancer related to responding to those attacks. So for us, for me, for the FBI, it's personal. And I can assure you, we haven't forgotten about 9/11. Now, in order to make sure that we don't forget about 9/11, one of the things that I've done, because we now have people joining the FBI who were just little kids when the attack. I know it's kind of crazy to think. We all remember exactly where we were, but pretty soon we're going to have people join the FBI who weren't even born when the attacks happened. So I decided that I wanted to have all new agents and analysts visit the 9/11 Memorial and Museum up in New York, and we worked out a very specific tour for them all to do that as part of their training. because it's one thing to know that there was an attack. It's another thing to feel the attack. And there's a sense of urgency, a sense of being on the balls of your feet, of never, ever, ever being complacent, that comes from feeling it and not just thinking it. And that's hard to recreate if you haven't lived it. But one way to recreate it is to have people go through that, I think, outstanding memorial. And I actually went with one of the very first classes to do it, because I wanted to see, like, is this having the effect that I want it to have? And I could see it in the eyes of the kids as they were going through this kind of, aha moment. And I thought, all right, that's what I'm looking for. Now, pivoting to where we are right now, the international terrorism threat, the foreign terrorist threat, is definitely alive and well. In some ways, we look forward, it could get worse. So we are concerned about, wasn't that long ago, maybe just a couple of years ago, we had an al-Shabaab guy who wanted to conduct a 9/11 style attack.
That's right.
Here in the United States. We're concerned about the Shia threat. The IRGC Quds Force from Iran, their proxies like Hezbollah, and their potential to conduct some retaliatory attack for the Soleimani strike. We're concerned about ISIS, especially ISIS-K, now in Afghanistan, as we lose a lot of our intelligence collection over there. We're worried about the possibility of a safe haven for al-Qaeda to reconstitute. And of course, ISIS, to some extent, people talk about the caliphate, but what we really worry about is the virtual caliphate, where they're all interconnected through social media and so forth. The other part of today's international terrorist threat that I think is different and in some ways more concerning is that a lot of the biggest terrorist threat facing Americans in the homeland is not from the traditional, sleeper cells that we were all focused on post 9/11. I mean, that's still there, to be clear, but now what you have are what are effectively lone actors who are not radicalized in some cave in Afghanistan, but are basically radicalized online by ISIS propaganda especially, but not exclusively. And they're motivated not to conduct some spectacular attack with a 747. They're just going to go get a gun, a knife, a car, some crude pipe bomb that they can put together just with a recipe off the internet, and go attack not a gigantic skyscraper, but any office space, any pedestrian walkway, any restaurant. And so you always hear this expression about connecting the dots. Well, the sleeper cell of the 9/11 era, you're talking about, 19 hijackers, and they're communicating, they're financing, they're planning, they're preparing, they're training. If intelligence and law enforcement know where to look, that's a lot of dots out there to connect. These effectively lone actors, they're not a lot of dots that exist. And there's very little time to connect them, because it doesn't take a lot of planning and preparation to decide, I'm just going to go get in my car and run over a bunch of people.
Yeah, the cycle for radicalization is far more compressed. And there's also, I wanted to add, I think the FBI is seeing that some of these want to be terrorists are also shopping around for different ideologies. It doesn't fit with what we all focused on in the 2000s.
We used to talk about people radicalizing until they mobilize. And that still exists,
Yeah.
but a lot of these are people who are kind of hardwired to commit violence. And so they start with the violence in their minds, and then they're online and they're looking for some hook to hang their hat on. So they search around looking at all the hateful stuff that's on the internet and decide, yeah, that's me. Now I got my excuse, I'm good to go. And that's just a different kind of terrorist to contend with. And we need eyes and ears. We need every tool at our disposal. And as we look forward on this threat in particular, especially as some of them get motivated and fueled and egged on by foreign actors overseas, we're going to need every tool in the toolbox. And that includes, for example, our FISA authorities, especially Section 702. I mean, that's when you look at us worrying about what could happen from Afghanistan, that's what allows the intelligence community to be targeting the al-Qaeda operative in Afghanistan, foreigner, overseas, terrorist. 702 is what allows us to know, wait a minute, that guy's communicating with a US email address. That can't be good. We need to know that. And I'd say this because 702 comes up for renewal next year. And I pray almost daily that we don't get sent, we the intelligence community don't get sent back into the arena with a blindfold and earplugs.
You and I both, and I appreciate your assessment of the international counterterrorism threat, having lived as a CT person the bulk of my career. So I do share your assessment. Before we get off that subject, because I want to talk about the internal threat, because I think it's absolutely crucial, I do want to give you an opportunity just to mention hostages and hostage families as kind of an adjunct to this discussion, because I know that you've engaged with hostage families, and we just had closure in the El Sheikh case, which was good news for the Beetle cell that captured and horrifically tortured Americans.
I mean, we the FBI and we the interagency take very seriously, the hostage taking of Americans. And I see in the FBI workforce that work on those issues a level of passion for the mission and dedication to the families that is really inspiring. And in some ways, one of the best examples of that is our interaction with Bob Levinson's family. And we, even though we've now come to closure, I've met repeatedly with his family. I feel they're an extension of the FBI family. And I think that's the approach we're trying to take in our engagement with, obviously, the victims of the Beatles and some of the other terrorist hostage takers as well.
Well, again, to put a finer point on it, I know that the families very much appreciate your personal engagement. I know that. The Levinsons, all the families, I could list them, but they appreciate that. And it's an important component of counterterrorism policy, resolving those cases. So I want to shift, because I'm looking at our clock and time is flying by here. I want to shift to the internal threat, domestic terrorism. And you might remember that we met on August 14th, 2017 at the White House in the immediate aftermath of Charlottesville. And since then, the domestic terrorism threat, the domestic violent extremist threat, however you characterize it, it has grown. Now, the FBI is always focused on DT, domestic terrorism, but clearly the threat landscape has changed, Director. So what are your thoughts on domestic terrorism, and is it a threat to democracy?
Well, it's a threat. It's a threat to American lives and to democracy. It's a threat in a lot of different ways. I mean, we have seen during my tenure a significant increase in our emphasis on domestic terrorism. I think that we had grown the number of domestic terrorism investigations by something like 50%. And as far back as the summer of 2019, I elevated racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism to our highest terrorism threat priority. And we've done things like, in the same year, we created a domestic terrorism hate crimes fusion cell to kind of bring those two pieces together. Of course, post January 6th, we're now up to about 2,900 domestic terrorism investigations. In the January 6th attack alone, we charged over 800 people. So we see it with racially and ethically motivated violent extremism. We see it with anti-government, anti-authority violent extremism. And we see it with this kind of mishmash of beliefs that I was referring to earlier, where it's not necessarily a coherent belief system. It's just a bunch of hate all kind of boiled together. And that sort of ties back to the social media point, which is a huge amplifier, an accelerant to this whole thing. There have always been angry, disaffected people, but before you could have some angry, hateful, disaffected guy who's living in, mom's attic or grandma's basement. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but, just festering. But now that guy's online, communicating with the same guys in other basements and attics, not only all over the country, but all over the world. And they're all egging each other on. And so we're seeing more and more angry, overheated rhetoric that kind of bubbles over into violence. And that's where we get involved. The FBI does not and will not investigate speech, beliefs, ideology, rhetoric. But in our country, it doesn't matter, what you're angry about or who you're angry with. There's a right way under the First Amendment to express how angry you are. And violence, assaults on law enforcement, destruction of property is not it. That's what the rule of law is all about. And I worry that we're getting into a stage where people judge whether or not something is fair or not, or right or not, based on whether it results in the outcome they wanted. And if your standard for whether the criminal justice system is fair or an election is fair is whether your side came out the way you wanted it to, then by definition, there's going to be scores of angry and upset people every single time, which is one thing. But if you then translate that anger into attacking the process and violence, then we got a real problem.
No, I appreciate that. I think you're alluding to polarization, and it certainly contributes to political violence. So we covered the waterfront, Director. We have talked about Russian cyber attacks. Hypothetically, we've talked about cyber intrusions from China. So multiple threat streams, and we talked about counterterrorism, domestic, you just talked about. Is there one threat that keeps you awake at night? Very cliched question, but I needed to answer that.
Well, let me start by being slightly flippant, which is I tell my family that I get asked all the time, does X is what keeps you awake at night? And their response is to start laughing and say, we wish you would just stay awake at the dinner table. Having said that, I understand you mean it more figuratively.
Right.
What worries me the most is, sure, all the threats we've talked about worry me, different times more than others. In some ways, what worries me the most is what Secretary Rumsfeld once famously called the unknown unknown. Mm-hmm. We've gotten pretty good at tackling the known known. The FBI is like a dog on a bone with that. And post 9/11, our integration of intelligence means we're getting pretty good at the known unknown. But the unknown unknown, which I know is out there, scares me. And the worry about the threats that we haven't identified yet, the whole new phenomenon. I'm not convinced that our country, our allies, that we're all that good at trying to kind of guess what that is and get in front of it. That's what worries me.
And the cliche of having to get it right all the time. Yeah, it's extraordinary. It is indeed an occupational hazard when you're responsible for protecting citizens, right? It is an extraordinary responsibility. So that leads me to the final question, which is open-ended. And we have a few more minutes. Please feel free to reflect for a second if you need to. But this has been an excellent discussion on the wide-ranging threats that the FBI face, that our national intelligence community faces. If you had to look out 5 years, you as the director, and you have 5 years left, I believe, right? You'll make it. I'm sure you will. You have 5
My wife is groaning somewhere, but
I'm sure.
Yeah, right.
Well, we need you. What does the future look like for the FBI?
Well, we're certainly not going to run out of things to do.
True.
I mean, I think the one thing we can be sure of is that the threats in 5 years will be even more complex, even more sophisticated, and that the FBI will have to adapt, as I think we always have. To me, it boils down to kind of maybe 3 big buckets. One is innovation and agility and adaptation. A second is commitment, doubling down on partnerships, both old and new. And then the third is the workforce, the people that we bring on, a much bigger, much more diverse workforce. So if I would unpack those, I guess on the innovation side, technology, of course, affects everything we do. In some ways, if you think about what the FBI does, either as a law enforcement agency or as an intelligence agency, we gather information, we analyze information, and we act on information. Well, in almost every investigation we have, there are sort of three things. There's the data, the evidence, the stuff. There's the people, the witnesses, the informants, the humans. And there's the money. We follow the money. Well, technology, on the first part, more and more companies, the tech companies, are choosing to design their architecture in a way that they are essentially blinding us all to information that we and they need to protect innocent people. So we're going blind there, and we have to find a solution to that. I mentioned the money. Well, more and more cryptocurrency makes it more challenging to follow the money. And then finally, on the witnesses, on the human side, on the human sources, what we call ubiquitous technical surveillance, which is essentially, you think about all the digital breadcrumbs we all leave, not necessarily intentionally. You combine that with artificial intelligence, things like that, facial recognition. It gets harder and harder to recruit a human source, an informant, and keep that informant safe and use that informant. So if we don't have the stuff, the money, or the people, we're in a world of trouble, right? So we're constantly looking for ways to innovate, to try to get ahead of all that. The good news is I think there's a lot of things that are happening at the FBI. It's much more innovative. We have a great thing going down in Huntsville, where we're co-located with the military and NASA. We're building a cyber training range where people can simulate cyber attacks and train there. We're building a smart city where people can simulate some of the things there. So there's just one example, but we're trying to be much more innovative. The partnerships, we already talked about partnerships with the private sector, even on the academic side. There's a lot of chatter in the media about the FBI's engagement with academia, but I can tell you, wouldn't be that long ago where universities wouldn't have wanted the FBI anywhere near campus. I go to universities all the time where they've set aside office space for the FBI. I did a ribbon cutting not that long ago at a major state university.
That is a change, isn't it?
That's a very different mindset. So non-traditional partners are a big part of it, foreign partners, but also we're never going to be backing away. We're going to stand shoulder to shoulder with our traditional partners, state and local law enforcement, because violent crime is still the biggest thing out there for most Americans and for most of law enforcement. And then the people, the workforce. I have been very diligent and proud to be able to attend every single agent and analyst graduation at Quantico. So everybody who's joined the FBI since I started has gotten their badge and credentials from me. I get to see them. The quality of the people joining today's FBI, it would be inspiring to everybody. And we still recruit heavily from law enforcement and military, but not exclusively. But the skill set of some of these people, I think the percentage of the classes now that have advanced degrees is like 60%. And at a time when recruiting and law enforcement more generally in this country has been suffering for a number of years, we saw starting in 2019, our recruiting tripled all across the country, people applying to be special agents. And we now have the highest number of agents on board in FBI history. Now we got to stay on it. And the diversity has improved dramatically. At every grade level, our workforce is more diverse than it was 4 years ago when I started, including at the leadership level. Our classes at Quantico are significantly more diverse, and that's important, and that's a good thing. What's not going to change is our values and our commitment to what I call process, which is the way we do the work, which is rigor, which is professionalism, which is objectivity. I call it doing the work in the right way, following the facts wherever they lead, no matter who likes it. And if there's anything that's become quite clear to me since doing this job is there's always somebody who doesn't like it.
5 more years.
Yeah,
Director.
right, exactly.
Let me just, that's terrific that you ended on that note, particularly on recruitment and also talking about going to those graduations. I've seen you at those graduations, so I very much appreciate all of your insights today, your candor, and your willingness to have this discussion with me. And I think I could say for this audience, we're very grateful for the FBI and very much appreciate you coming out here.
Thank you.
And thank you to everybody here.
Thank you.